Greetings, Chair Drew, EFSEC Council and staff, and the public. For the record, my name is Patricia Betts. I provide support to EFSEC for implementing the State Environmental Policy Act for the Horse Heaven proposals, environmental review, and EIS preparation.
Can you pause for just a minute? Is there a way we can have the volume up?
I apologize. Is that
That's
better?
okay.
Okay. I have prepared a presentation to provide some basic information about an environmental impact statement and to talk a little bit about the contents of this EIS and about reviewing it. I'm happy to take questions at the end of the presentation. I have not prepared a long list of slides, but I do have a fair amount of information that I'd like to share with each of those that I have prepared. So
okay, if you can just move closer to your microphone because we are having a little bit of trouble hearing you, that would be great.
Is this better?
Just a little bit.
Okay, all right. 1 second and I will move my laptop closer to me. Okay, is this any better?
Quite a bit, thank you.
Okay, all right. So if we can move to the first slide, what is an environmental impact statement? So SEPA stands for the State Environmental Policy Act. And in regards to what an EIS is, I'm going to just talk about 4 basic points on what an EIS analyzes and when an EIS is prepared. An EIS requires agencies with an agency action on a proposal to consider the adverse environmental impacts of the proposal prior to making a decision whether to approve with conditions, or deny the proposal. It's prepared when there is an indication the proposal would or could result in significant adverse environmental impacts, or when the agency and the applicant agree an EIS is the best approach for analyzing the impacts of the proposal. And I believe in the case of this project, we did, the applicant and EFSEC ultimately did agree that an EIS was the best path forward for this project or for this proposal. An EIS analyzes the adverse environmental impacts of the proposal and identifies mitigation that could reduce those impacts. It also examines any alternatives to the proposal that would meet the objectives of that proposal, but with lower environmental consequences. And it generally does not examine positive environmental impacts of the proposal, except when those positive impacts could be mitigating identified adverse environmental impacts that are in the EIS. A draft EIS provides the public, local, state, and federal agencies and tribal governments the opportunity to comment on the completeness and accuracy of the EIS before it is finalized. And then thirdly, the EIS analyzes environmental impacts and must be used by agency decision makers along with other relevant considerations or documents in making final decisions on a proposal. So it is not the only document or considerations that will be used by decision makers to decide whether to approve with conditions, or deny the proposal. For example, decision makers may take the general welfare, social, economic, and state policy into account in weighing and balancing alternatives and in making final decisions. So it's a very important document, but it's not the only piece of information that decision makers use. We can move to the next slide. So the table presented on this slide will be found at the end of chapter 1, and it provides a little bit of information about each of the chapters, and I'm just going to briefly talk about those. There's an executive summary, and it is not intended as a standalone document. It provides fundamental information, but each chapter, such as 2, 3, 4, and 5, provides a more complete discussion. The executive summary includes a large summary table. However, the tables at the end of each resource section in chapter 4 provide a more comprehensive assessment and directly reflect the information provided in that resource section's narrative. The executive summary also includes a comprehensive list of key issues. And those are not discussed in other chapters of the document. So that is specific to the executive summary. Chapter 1, purpose of action, provides an introduction to the proposal, the applicant, the CEPA process, agency decision making, and maybe a short, a very, very brief discussion or short summary of the key issues. The Chapter 2, the information in Chapter 2 is the applicant's description of their proposal. It covers construction, operation, and decommissioning. The applicant identified a maximum footprint for the proposal so that the adverse environmental impacts of all possible components would be analyzed. This chapter also provides a collated list of applicant commitments. So if a reader has a question about what the proposal will entail, this section should provide that information. Alternatives are also discussed at the end of Chapter 2. The proposal is also known as an action alternative. And so there is also a no action alternative, which analyzes the impacts to the environment if the proposal were not permitted and constructed. And this provides a comparison of environmental impacts with and without the project. Only one action alternative was analyzed in the draft EIS, which is the applicant's proposal. Although there are no other action alternatives, the EIS does examine the specific adverse environmental impacts of some of the components of the proposal. For example, it examines the turbine option of up to 150 taller turbines and the turbine option of up to 244 shorter turbines and the 3 different solar array locations. And so this additional information about each of those components can identify which, if any, of those components are contributing to a medium or high impact, and will assist in further examination of possible options to mitigate the impact of those components and ultimately reduce the impact of the comprehensive proposal. Chapter 3 is about the project. It's about the environment, the existing or affected environment is covered in Chapter 3, and the project, because the project is going to cause disturbance and impacts to environmental resources, it's important for us to know what the existing condition is of the resources that are going to be affected by the project. There's actually 14 environmental resource topics covered in the EIS. There's the natural environment, which includes earth, air, water, vegetation, wildlife, and habitat. And then there's the built environment, which includes energy, land, and shoreline use, historic and cultural resources, visual, noise and vibration, recreation, public health and safety, transportation, public services, and utilities. Socioeconomics is normally not analyzed in an EIS. However, SX rules require socioeconomics to be analyzed. Rather than creating a separate socioeconomics document, it is included in the EIS as the 15th topic. In order to understand the impacts of the proposal, we need to first understand the existing environmental condition of the environment that could be impacted by the project. For some environmental resources, we may need to understand the environmental condition offsite as well. For example, if a project creates noise during construction, that noise may extend beyond the project site. In Chapter 3, the EIS collects information about the existing sound conditions and the type of activities, such as residential, recreation, commercial, industrial, in the areas where the project's construction noise can reach. Additionally, environmental justice impacts are examined in the socioeconomic section. Environmental justice analyzes disproportionate adverse impacts to low-income and minority populations. And that, and although, as I mentioned, socioeconomics is not a traditional part of an EIS, environmental justice issues have become a standard part of EISs. It just makes sense, though, to put it in the socioeconomics section. For Chapter 4, the impact analysis in Chapter 4 is based on the project description information provided by the applicant in Chapter 2. The terms direct and indirect relates to the impacts of the proposal on the various environmental resources. It examines the changes that would occur to the existing conditions described in Chapter 3 and translates those changes as appropriate into environmental impacts. Impacts can be very close in time and distance from the project. For example, vegetation that's removed during construction, and can also be later in time or farther in distance, but still be the result of the project. For example, the vegetation that was removed provided a food source or range area for wildlife. Both are impacts of the proposal. It is less important to worry whether an impact is direct or indirect, and more important to ensure both types of impacts are considered. And then lastly, there are a variety of options for accomplishing mitigation, and that's another discussion that occurs in Chapter 4. There may be avoidance, there may be minimization, there may be rectifying the impact, reducing or eliminating the impact over time, compensating for the impact, and or monitoring with a contingency. We consider all those forms of mitigation, and I expect you will see all those included as part of the comprehensive package of mitigation measures that have been identified for this project. And then we also have a responsibility with regards to determining significance. In SEPA, it is defined as a reasonable likelihood of more than a moderate adverse impact on environmental quality. And as my mentor often said, she would say that, suggest that that was clear as mud. And it is a very somewhat vague description of how one would determine significance. But we are required to identify significant adverse environmental impacts that cannot or will not be mitigated, and we have done so in the EIS. And as part of being able to determine significance, we've used 4 factors which will be identified as impact ratings in the EIS, and we've used 4 factors that are descriptors, you might say, or adjectives that are used for helping to identify how one is going to determine significance. And those are magnitude, duration, likelihood, and the spatial or extent or setting of the impacts. Each factor helps the reader to consider how much of an environmental concern the impact should be. And the beginning of each resource section in Chapter 4 defines these 4 factors. And then for magnitude, the description is actually covered in each resource section and is unique to that resource. So there'll be specific identifiers and descriptions for Earth and how one determines magnitude as it relates to Earth, as it relates to air, as it relates to water, and so on. And then lastly, there's the cumulative impacts section. And that the cumulative impacts are those that are direct and indirect impacts of the proposal that can increase in significance when considered along with past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future projects that have also impacted the same resource. So, for example, loss of habitat within a wildlife movement corridors contributes to habitat fragmentation and barriers to wildlife by affecting an animal's ability to move between habitats on the landscape. It can present obstacles that can deter wildlife movement, such as fences or roads, and or require wildlife to expend additional energy to move around. The project has the potential to contribute to these cumulative barriers to wildlife movement, along with past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future projects. So that's an example of a cumulative impact issue that we look at in this EIS. And then cumulative impacts are, besides direct and indirect impacts, SEPA requires us to consider cumulative impacts and how the proposal contributes to those. So it's a mandatory part of of analysis in an EIS. We can move to the next slide. So just wanted to maybe provide a few pointers for reviewing the draft EIS and kind of understanding the overall organization of the document. It's important to understand that all the chapters are interrelated. Don't be surprised if you end up moving between chapters as you read about a particular topic. The executive summary provides brief information about the entire EIS and provides additional context for reviewing the rest of the chapters. But it is not a summarized regurgitation of the whole document, which might be the case for or expectation when you see something labeled as an executive summary. Remember that the end of chapter 1 describes the contents of each chapter if you need a refresher of how it's all put together. And familiarize yourself with the proposal and the information in chapter 2. That's just the proposal description. And the beginning of chapter 3 and 4 provides some basic explanation about key terms and content that applies to all of chapter 3 and 4. And then use chapter 3 and 4 together. You can read about the impacts in chapter 4 and refer to the information in chapter 3 to understand how or why the impacts are identified in chapter 4. And then the end of each chapter 4 resource section also identifies the applicant commitments relevant to that resource topic, and it summarizes the impacts of the proposal and identifies mitigation and help that can help to reduce those impacts. Refer to the appendices when you want more detailed information on a particular resource discussed in chapter 4. Next slide. So providing comments on the draft EIS. FSEC's created a comment database that commenters can use to submit their comments. And the link to that database will be provided on FSEC's Horse Heaven website along with the draft EIS. Comments should be as specific as possible and may address either the adequacy of the EIS and/or the merits of the alternatives discussed. The public is encouraged to comment on the methodology needed, additional information, and mitigation measures. For example, is information missing or incorrect? Is there additional mitigation that should be considered? Or are there impacts that are being underrated or overrated? Or, for example, you might think that just the spatial extent of an impact may be incorrectly described. Maybe instead of being local, you might think it should be more of a regional impact. Remember to provide your reasoning for why the rating should be changed. And because FSEC is responsible for the completeness and accuracy of the information in the EIS, we review the comments and confirm any information that is provided by commenters before inserting any changes into the final EIS. So the more evidence and/or explanation as to why you think something should be changed or added or deleted will provide us with the information that we need to confirm that it's a relevant comment that we need to use for modifying the EIS or collecting additional information. There are comments that are not relevant on an EIS and they're not used for the final EIS and not used as a substantive, considered a substantive comment received. So expressions of support or opposition of the proposal are not going to be useful. Comments of the value, for another example, might be comments about the value of renewable energy or the use of fossil fuels are as well not the kind of comments that are going to help us to improve the completeness and accuracy of the EIS. And to the last slide on the final environmental impact statement. As I mentioned above, there will be a final environmental impact statement, and there are changes that occur between the draft EIS and the final EIS. Those are expected and normal. For example, for one thing, during the EIS process, projects or applicants respond to the identified environmental impacts. They often make adjustments to the proposal based on the information about impacts and mitigation in the draft EIS. Applicants may have identified other changes or details related to the proposal as a result of further work defining the proposal. So that's one kind of change that we might find between the draft and the final. Also, the project description, applicant commitments, and agency identified mitigation typically evolves. Although changes to the project during the process creates more work between the draft and the final EIS, the changes also meet the intent of SEPA, which is to result in an environmentally improved project. Decision makers will ultimately decide whether that refined project should be approved with conditions, or denied. And lastly, a final EIS includes responses to public comments, more analysis when warranted, responding to those comments, new analysis responding to project changes, and more or refined mitigation. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I appreciate you letting me get through that. Are there any questions that follow-up questions that anybody has?
Thank you, Ms. Betts, for your very thorough description of what to expect in each section and how to review the EIS. I think that serves the council well, and hopefully also the people who are listening and participating on this call as they review it and look and prepare comments. Again, once the draft EIS is published, it will be 45 days from that you will have an opportunity to comment. Are there questions from the Horse Heaven council members? Mr. Levitt?
I have one brief question. Can you talk briefly about, I see there's 7 agencies that provided scoping comments, and just from a technical standpoint, how you go about integrating feedback on the scope. And I also see there were no tribal comments during the scoping. Could you just briefly talk about the scoping comments, please?
I'm sorry, this is Brianna, the stenographer. Can I ask who the last speaker was?
This is Eli Levitt, Department of Ecology.
Thank you.
Well, if I remember correctly, I don't remember exactly which those 7 agencies were, but basically what happens is that we follow up with all those agencies as we're working on preparing the draft EIS. We get clarification from them on what their concerns are, but then we include them to assist us with clearly collect if we need to collect additional information, if we need to actually do some additional work either with the applicant. In at least one case, we brought everybody together and not only kind of like figured out how to define the project, how to identify the impacts, but also to discuss mitigation and come up with additional ideas for mitigation. And some of those things would ended up being applicant commitments, and some of those ended up being additional mitigation that based on feedback from those agencies and our consultant, et cetera, we identified additional mitigation that was warranted. We also did actually do a great deal of outreach with the Yakima tribe, or the Yakima Nation, and we are continuing to do that work, or communications with them, with their staff, I should say. And it's the same kind of thing where we are working with them to understand what their concerns are, to see if there is, and so that clearly articulate what the impacts are in the EIS, and also to investigate possible mitigation. As I mentioned to you, there were about 6 different kinds of mitigation, anywhere from avoidance to monitoring, to investigate then what kinds of mitigation might be most appropriate and feasible for the impacts that have been identified. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I also see that there are general scoping comments that don't come from agencies, so I imagine we or you, FSAC, review them and consider them when drafting the draft EIS.
Absolutely. Our first and foremost responsibility during scoping is to consider all comments that were received and use those to determine what we need to investigate and collect additional information for. I believe, and perhaps maybe Amy Moon or Amy Hofkemeier can confirm, I believe we do have a scoping report. Is
Scoping report. So
And this is
that
this is
this
Amy
is-
Moon. Yes.
Yes, thank you. A scoping report doesn't ring a bell, Patty. I would have to look at that. But I did just want to confirm with you, Eli, when you said that there were 7 agencies, do you mean the scoping comments that are posted to the Horse Heaven project on the FSEC public website?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and we don't have tribal comments posted there, but as Patty said, we have been working with pretty closely with staff at the Yakima Nation on that. But so Eli, I'll have to report back next month if there is a scoping report, because that's just not ringing a bell, Patty.
okay, well, and it may not have been called a scoping report. We did we used our consultant to assist us to review all of the scoping comments and basically identified the kinds of comments that we received, you know, the extent of those comments, and then ultimately determined which ones needed to be carried forward into the draft EIS. Some of the comments may not have been, you know, qualified as substantive kinds of comments that were appropriate for an environmental impact statement. But we have, you might say, some documentation about what we received during scoping and then how that fed into the scope that was set for the environmental impact statement.
Yeah, and Patty, this is Amy again, and Eli, and the FSEC Council, is we did issue a memorandum to the SEPA responsible official, which is Sonia Bumpus, that did summarize scoping of what the DEIS would include. And that was September 20th of 2021.
Thank you, Amy. They're oftentimes called scoping reports, but a scoping memorandum is another type of the same kind of document.
Any more questions?
That answer your question, Eli?
Yes, it does. I mean, there's lots of interesting ideas in some of those scoping comments, like studying the traffic, the dust, the light, you know, the views. So it'll be interesting to see what's in the draft EIS when we're ready to review it.
Thank you. Are there questions from other council members for the Horse Heaven Council?
Chair Drew, this is Kay Kelly.
Go ahead.
The question I have is, when we went to visit the Horse Heaven site, and thank you FSEC staff for that wonderful visit. You aren't responsible for the weather. It seemed like the project was not in a defined state of planning, that there were some parts and pieces that still needed to be settled on. So when the EIS is conducted, does it take into account that it would be full build out, or how does that work if the project is ultimately changed once we get close to final, or if we get close to final?
So first off, the applicant has identified what they believe to be the maximum footprint, with the understanding that it will probably not be the maximum, but that they wanted the flexibility to choose between the three solar array locations, to choose between the taller, fewer turbines, and or the shorter, great, 244 shorter turbines or 150 taller turbines. So they have identified what they believe to be the maximum footprint, and that was analyzed in the EIS. If the applicant changes their proposal, and let's just say, for example, they decide that there's some acreage somewhere that they had not originally anticipated they wanted to use, but they now want to use that acreage, and it's added to the proposal, we have to re-examine that from a SEPA perspective. But that it could trigger a supplemental EIS, or it could trigger an addendum to the EIS. And it just depends on whether or not the proposal changes enough, or the additional impacts, there are new or greater impacts, a large additional acreage, and maybe sensitive habitats, etc. All those factors are taken into consideration. The bottom line is that we have to document that in a SEPA document. We have to analyze that in a SEPA document. And if the changes are significant enough from an adverse environmental impact perspective, then we could potentially be pushed into a supplemental EIS. That's partly why the applicant has provided this quote unquote maximum footprint information to us, hoping that we've got it covered in this first draft EIS. But as I mentioned, changes can occur if the proposal gets smaller, or some aspects of the proposal are removed. Let's just say, for example, they decided they didn't want to do battery energy storage. Well, that wouldn't be the kind of change that would trigger really more than just an addendum, for example, a minor or just or would just be acknowledged in the final EIS. So that might kind of give you some idea as to, we do have to document it, we do have to analyze it, but it does, there's a couple of pathways that we might end up use for dealing with it.
If I can also add on that, what Ms. Bess is describing is what the applicant might choose to do, but it is ultimately the responsibility of this Horse Heaven FSEC Council to make a recommendation to the governor, which includes the elements of the EIS as information to deliberate, as well as the adjudicative process, which we'll talk about next. And so the council does have the flexibility to look at all of those overall impacts and make a recommendation to the governor that is specific to the information that we have received throughout the process. And then the governor has the choices whether to accept our recommendation, whether to reject our recommendation, or whether to ask us, send it back to us for more work. So although the applicant has submitted what they consider to be the maximum footprint and the information within that, the council also has a responsibility to look at all that information and to make deliberate and make that recommendation to the governor as we see the information provides us.
Thank you.
Any other questions from council members? Okay, hearing none, I think we are moving from this